In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the rear, inner and outer wheel bearings on this Ford F-350. When removing the hub to do this job, it is important to have a new seal on hand so you can also replace this. Otherwise, you will have a gear oil leak coming from the back of the hub. Let's get started. Let's remove the wheel. Sometimes these wheels have some center caps, so you're going to want to use a pry bar or screwdriver to pop that off before you get to the lug nuts. Usually if you just look around, there's going to be a cutout at some point that you can use to pry out on. And that exposes your 8 21mm headed lug nuts, so let's take those off. With those off, remove the wheel and set it aside. Let's remove the caliper and bracket assembly. We're going to remove the 2 21mm headed bolts that hold this onto the rear axle. These might be difficult to reach because of clearance here, so use a swivel socket with a power tool or break them free with a breaker bar and then remove them by hand. Leave this one in a few threads so it can hold this on while we remove the top one. Take that out, remove the caliper and bracket assembly with the pads right off of the rotor. I don't want to put pressure on this brake hose, so I don't want to hang it by it, but what I do have is a bungee cord, so I can hang it on that right behind the shock absorber. And now remove the rotor. Sometimes it's stuck on here. Mine's new, so it's not going to be stuck. But if yours is, you can hit the side of it with a hammer. That should help break it free without damaging the braking surface or potentially hitting the studs or the threads of them if you're hitting right here. All right. On the side, on each shoe, you'll see this spring clip with a pin going through it. My pin is actually not attached to the backing plate, and that's why it's loose, but regardless, you're gonna do the same thing to loosen it up and unhook it really. You're gonna twist this spring off and remove it, and then you can push the pin through and remove that. Mine is stuck here just because it's jammed in where it is, so I'm gonna have to take it off with the shoe, but you can remove your pin and do the same to the other shoe. A little bit hard to see right here, but there's a spring and then our adjuster. Let's pop the spring off, which actually sometimes can be easier if we not only close up this adjuster, but remove it completely. So let's grab a pry bar. All right. All right, take that out. Inspect all these items that you remove. We're going to reuse the hardware. I'll show you how to loosen that adjuster up and lubricate it. For now, let's remove the shoes. Taking these off, you can easily use a pry bar. Pry them out of their slot at the top. That will loosen tension on the spring, and then you can remove the other shoe. And there they are. Twist them apart to get the spring off. This spring is in great shape. There's your shoes. With a collection bucket underneath to catch the gear oil that's going to leak out, remove all of the 15mm headed bolts, bolting the axle onto the hub. There we go. Pry that out. Now gently and carefully pull the axle away. At this point, we have to remove the ratcheting nut that is in there to release the hub. Typically, you would use this tool right here. This goes right on it. It's meant for it. It's got the little pins that lock it in, and this in the center, that makes it sit right inside the axle tube. So slide it over, turn it until it locks in, and then put your 1/2-inch drive ratchet on it. Keep in mind that the driver's side will actually have left-hand threads, so it's reverse threaded, while the passenger side will have regular threads. And that's just because of the direction that the wheels spin in most of the time. Just in case this nut starts unthreading, well, it can if it's left-handed threads. Having said that, you're gonna wanna turn to the right so as if you were tightening to loosen this up. Also, while you do that, you wanna press in so that you can push that ratcheting mechanism away so it can actually turn. Once you get it far enough, it should just unthread by itself. Set that aside. Now you should be able to wiggle this just enough to pop that outer bearing out, and with a magnet you can fish it right out of there. Set that aside. Now using a pry bar, pry this from the back to pop it off of the axle. It moves, but the seal's holding it in place. There it goes. Take this off, inspect this, and make sure that it is in good shape, especially if you had a failed bearing of some sort. And you want to make sure that you clean everything so you can thoroughly inspect it. This is the other half of our seal, which we will have to remove, which you can simply do with either a pry bar or a chisel. Everything looks good here, so let's get that seal off. Since we're here, let's clean off the area that the seal rides on. I want to get all of this rust off. I want to make sure that it's clean and free of any debris. This all looks great. The seal doesn't actually go all the way on, so it only goes up until where the rust starts. So I'm not worried about it. This looks perfect. If you wanted to clean up some of the rust, you can, but you definitely don't want to touch this surface, which is perfectly machined to seal up. With the hub in a vise, I'm able to use a pry bar, put some pressure on the seal sideways, and slowly work it out of its groove until it pops out. Oh, there we go. And with it removed, we can now take our inner bearing out. There it is. Looking through this hub now, we can see the race for the outer bearing and the race for the inner bearing. Doesn't matter which one you start with. I'm just going to start with this one since it's sitting flat. I'm going to use a punch and punch that through. Go back and forth with your punch so you can drive this out evenly. And there it goes. And there is the race for the outer bearing. We'll set this aside, flip this over, and do the same that way for the inner bearing. And there it goes. And there's the inner race. Let's get our new bearings installed. Since the hub is facing up, I'm just going to start with putting in the outer bearing. Make sure you put the race for it facing the correct way. You don't want it facing down because obviously you can't put the bearing in. You want it facing up. We'll drop it down into place just like that. And if you have a bearing or seal installer that is this diameter, go ahead and use it. However, I do not. So what I'm going to do is use the same method that I used to remove them and just slowly and carefully tap it down all the way. That's completely bottomed out. You can hear a clear difference between when it's still going down and when it is fully seated. So if you look closely in there, you'll see that there is no gap between the lip that this race bottoms out on and the lip itself. And of course, like I said, you can hear the difference. So at this point, let's flip this over and do the same thing to install the inner race. Of course, just like with the other one, make sure it's facing the correct way. All right, that's it right there. It's completely bottomed out. You can hear the difference once again. Let's install the inner wheel bearing. This has to go in now, and to do this, I'm going to add some gear oil to it. I don't want to put it in dry, even though it will get oiled up once it's in there and we top off the differential. I always like to add oil to it before it goes in, just a little bit. So get your gear oil and drizzle it all along the bearings, and then just roll it. Rolling it will work it in perfectly even all the way around. You don't need to have it dripping with oil, but you do want to have a film of oil on it so it doesn't start up dry. And you can already hear the difference. It doesn't sound like it's loose anymore. Put a little bit on here. Perfect. We'll drop that down, just like that. Now, on top of that inner bearing, there was this. So you want to make sure that this little spacer goes facing down. It's got a couple clips. They, once again, need to face down, not up. Okay, perfect. It's time to install our seal. Drop it down, and because this truck has ABS, it's got this tone ring here. So usually I would use a flat piece of wood and a rubber mallet and just hit this seal all the way down until it is fully seated, but I can't do that because of this. So I'm still going to use a piece of wood, but what I'm going to do is use a bearing race that fits perfectly on the outside of this seal. That's going to make it so I'm only putting pressure on this outer ridge of the seal as opposed to the seal itself, the rubber part, which would damage the seal. So put your piece of wood on top just to have a flat surface to hammer on. I'm going to use a rubber mallet and drive this down all the way. All right, that's flush all the way around. It's driven in perfectly flat. So this is good to go back on the truck. Let's give this a quick wipe down to make sure that it's free of debris and clean. Minimal oil on it. It's okay if it's a little bit oily, but as long as it's clean, we're good to go. Now take your wheel hub with the bearings and slide this right over very gently in order to not ruin the seal that's in the back. Once you get most of the way on, push it. And you can use a rubber mallet to finish seating it to where the seal actually pushes all the way on. Let's take out our rag that we put in here. Now I'm going to put some oil, gear oil that is, all the way in there where the inner bearing sits, just so it doesn't start up dry really, and it's going to get soaked in oil after we top off the differential, but I want to make sure that there's some there to start. I have a piece of hose on my gear oil bottle that's going to allow me to put it all the way back there without making a mess. Let's put some oil on the outer bearing before this goes in. And slide this in. A little bit more oil. And finally, the nut that secures it all together. On the back side, you'll see that it has this little tab. This tab needs to line up with the cutout on the axle tube, otherwise it won't go on. And remember, the driver's side is reverse threaded, so you're going to have to turn it counterclockwise to thread it on. Stick your special socket in and tighten it up. Okay, so you want to make this tight, that way you can seat the bearings. You'll feel that as you make this tighter and you try to spin the hub, it's going to get more difficult to spin. That's normal. Yeah, right now it is pretty snug, but it's important to do this because that's the only way to seat those bearings in place. And, of course, finish seating the hub onto the axle. It's important to spin it so that you can help these bearings seat But of course this is way too tight. So after you're done, we're gonna have to back this off. Otherwise, the bearings are going to fail pretty much immediately. So, back this off a little bit. That spins freely now. And we're gonna tighten it until it feels snug, but still spins freely. It's a little too tight right there, but right there feels pretty good. Basically, too tight and you'll destroy the bearings from them being clamped on and overheating and way too much pressure on them. Too loose and you'll destroy the bearings because they are wobbling around and the hub isn't actually seated on the taper of those bearings properly. So once you get it just right, you can move on. You want it to spin freely, like I said, with very minimal resistance, and this should feel somewhat snug. It's time to put the axle in, and on the end of the axle right here where it mounts to the hub, there's going to be an O-ring. Replace it if necessary. This is what seals things up. There's no gasket or RTV needed on the outside. And of course, make sure the surfaces are clean, both on the axle as well as on the hub side. Not just here, because it does need to mount flush, but also here where the O-ring sits. Now put the axle in carefully. It's going to be inevitable for it to rest and slide on the differential tube, but just try to be gentle about it and don't push it. Don't try to drag it along the whole way. And once you get most of the way in, you'll feel that it needs to lift up on the end. That's so it can fall into the gears on the differential itself. And you might need to spin it or twist it at the same time so that you can line up the splines. You're not going to be able to see anything you're doing, but eventually it'll pop in. There we go. Perfect. Now before we put these bolts in, you want to make sure you clean all the threads in here with some brake parts cleaner. You don't want oil getting stuck back there, so use brake parts cleaner and some compressed air to blow them out. Clean the threads of the bolts, and then we'll apply some blue thread locker to all of these so that they can stay locked in tight. I got the threads cleaned and thread locker on all the bolts, so I'm going to install them into the hub to lock in the axle. Here's the deal with the torque for these. If you have a Ford axle, you're going to torque these to 37 foot-pounds in a cross pattern, and then an additional 90 degrees also in a cross pattern on all of these bolts. If you have a Dana axle, it's just straight up 98 foot-pounds in a cross pattern and you're done. I have a Ford axle, so I'm going with 37 foot-pounds and then 90 degrees. Now because I bottomed these out with an impact, they are way above 37 foot-pounds, so I'm going to loosen them up, torque them, and then additional 90 degrees after that. In order to keep this hub from spinning, I'm going to put a pry bar in between the lug studs to keep it steady while I do all that. That was 37 foot-pounds. Let's go for 90 degrees, which is a quarter turn. I have a digital torque wrench that does read degrees, but if you don't, just mark them and eyeball 90 degrees. You don't have to be spot on as long as you're close. All right. Those are all tight. Now, in all honesty, 90 degrees felt a little too tight for me, so I went about 60. It's a little bit less than a quarter turn, but that is very tight, so we're good to go here. Let's prepare the backing shield for some parking brake shoes, and these little divots or bumps that it has here are actually where you want to apply some brake grease or high temperature silicone paste that is rated for brakes, and that is so that the parking brake shoes don't squeak when they go on and operate. I'm also going to put some silicone paste right where they sit at the top. That way, once again, they don't squeak, but also they won't seize over time. I'm going to do the same to the other side of this shield, and then we'll install them. Put some of that same brake grease or silicone paste right on the threads over here and work that into the threads. That way, well, it doesn't seize in the future. Take this little star wheel and bring it in all the way. Not only does it have to be like that when we install it, but it helps to work that grease into the threads, like I said. There we go. And apply some on the very end so that all of the threads can be properly coated. Put these two halves back together, and this is now ready to be installed. It's time to install the shoes, and I'm going to make sure that the smaller cutout is at the top with this rectangular cutout for where the spring goes. Now what you want to do is take the spring and make sure that the hook part is facing towards the back of the shoe as well as pointing down so that it can hook in to this cutout and sit flat up against it. If you look from the back side, it'll have to follow the curvature of this shoe. Now you take the other shoe and you do the same thing, hook it in, and now we'll have to stretch this over the top and actually install the shoes. This part will be quite tricky. Be very careful of pinch points so you don't hurt yourself. All right, so I got it seated. Obviously the shoes want to come off of here. They're pulling away. That's normal. The spring is under quite a bit of tension. Now what you want to make sure is that everything is fully seated here. So grab a screwdriver, pry bar, pry on things, make sure that it is in position, because that will make it easier to install the rest of your hardware. Everything is seated on this lever. It's okay if it doesn't touch this top mounting point here. So let's grab the pins and lock the shoes in. Stick the pin through the backing shield and through the shoe. And for these, because they're a hook style, what I found easiest, if you put a little bit of grease right on the end of the clip here, that's actually going to make it easier to hook it on. Okay, make sure that's fully seated, and then we'll do the same to the other side shoe. Let's put in the spring and, of course, the adjuster at the bottom. The spring goes into a couple little cutouts that are right at the base here where it's a little bit difficult to see. So I'm going to put that in first because it's easier to push these shoes together to get the spring hooked on, and then I can just use a pry bar to separate them to get the adjuster in. The adjuster is lubricated and it's ready to go, and it is not directional because this doesn't self-adjust like drum brakes. It doesn't really matter which way you put it in. So slide it on, pry these shoes apart. There we go. Make sure the adjuster is fully seated. At this point, it is completely collapsed. The shoes are as close as they can possibly be, and that's where you want to start with when you have new shoes so that you can adjust them correctly. So at this point, let's put the rotor over, and this is where you're going to make your adjustment until everything is adjusted correctly. Slide the rotor on, and let's check for the adjustment of the shoes. Okay, I can hear them touch a little bit. So that's a good sign. However, what I will do now is apply the parking brake, and that will actually seat the shoes evenly left and right. Then we'll try again, because sometimes after you apply the parking brake, they are most likely going to have less contact once they've centered themselves up. A quick way to do this is to just go on the back side and pull on that lever with a pry bar. that actuates the parking brakes instead of going up into the vehicle and applying the actual parking brake pedal. I am no longer hearing the shoes just like I thought. What I'm actually hearing is the other side. So I'm going to pull this back off, increase the distance on my adjuster just a little bit. A small adjustment goes a long way here, and then we'll try the same thing again. Okay, I can hear them touch just a little bit. That's exactly what you want from parking brake shoes. You don't want to hear them drag. You don't want to have resistance on the rotor. For these, they just have to be very close so that when you apply that parking brake pedal, they only have to expand a little bit until they catch and hold the vehicle. So I'm going to leave it adjusted as is. However, we have to pull the rotor back out to cover the hub in some anti-seize so it doesn't go on dry with no corrosion protection. With the hub nice and clean, apply some anti-seize to the surface so that you don't have corrosion building up. Try to avoid getting it on the lug studs and of course also the parking brake shoes. And you want to keep it a nice thin layer because if you put too much, it's actually going to squish out when the rotor goes on and it's going to start flinging on the area where the parking brake shoes ride, and you don't want that to happen. Take your rotor and slide it on. To make sure it stays seated in place and doesn't move around, I'm going to put 2 lug nuts on and bottom them out gently. Take the caliper and slide it over the rotor. And put in your 2 bolts that mount it onto the axle. The torque on both of these bolts is 203 foot-pounds. All right, that's tight. On the driver's side of the differential, you'll see where the fill plug is. We'll use a 3/8 drive extension or directly the ratchet to remove this plug so we can top off the fluid. There we go. If you have a Dana rear end, you're going to use 75W90 gear oil. If you have a Ford differential, which is what I have here, you're going to use 75W140 oil. Fill this up until it starts coming out of the fill hole. That's when you know it's fully topped off. Once that's full, reinstall the fill plug. Wipe off the area so it stops dripping. And tighten it up. That's bottomed out. Give it a little extra. That's plenty tight and sealed off. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 8 lug nuts. We'll bottom them out in a cross pattern, and also in a cross pattern, torque them to 165 foot-pounds. Once again, 165 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Double check them if you want. And then of course, if your vehicle had these lug nut covers, go ahead and put these back on. Line them up. Tap them on, and there you have it. Don't forget to top off the master cylinder, pump up the brake pedal, and take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.